Imagine building your entire life around the execution of a convicted criminal, not admiring him from a distance, betting your whole future on him. To most people, that sounds absurd. The strange part is, Christianity has been making exactly that claim for 2,000 years, and it hasn't slowed down yet. The man who wrote more of the New Testament than anyone else knew exactly how it sounded. He said that was the point. Here's where it happened. Corinth, a booming Roman port city where ships unloaded fortunes daily, and public speakers built entire careers by out-arguing each other in front of crowds gathered in the marketplace. Winning an argument, well, was practically a spectator sport. In Corinth, sounding intelligent was social currency. It's the one detail you need to understand everything that comes next. Walk with me for a moment outside the city walls. Public executions weren't hidden away back then. They happened along main roads, on purpose, as a warning to anyone thinking about crossing Rome. Crucifixion wasn't just execution. It was Rome's most deliberately humiliating punishment, reserved for slaves and rebels, designed to strip away every shred of dignity, slowly, in front of everyone passing by. Nobody watching that scene thought victory. They thought loser. That's the image sitting behind every mention of the cross in Paul's letters, not a piece of jewelry, a scene of horror. There's actual evidence of how strange this looked to outsiders. In Rome, archaeologists found a piece of graffiti carved into a wall, now known as the Alexamenos Graffito, showing a man worshipping a figure on a cross with a donkey's head and a scrawled caption mocking him for it. Someone, centuries ago, thought the idea of worshipping a crucified man was funny enough to carve into a wall as an insult. That's not a metaphor. That's a physical object you can go see today. Now, shift the scene. A traveling preacher walks into that same status-obsessed city and tells a room full of educated Corinthians that his entire message centers on a man who died exactly that way. Picture the reaction. Not confusion, something closer to second-hand embarrassment, the kind you feel when a friend tells you completely sincerely that they've bet everything on something everyone already failed. Think about trying to tell your own children years later that this executed man is somehow your king. That's the sentence Paul was asking an entire city to accept. That preacher was Paul. And here's the twist. He wasn't oblivious to any of this. He named it directly in a letter he later sent back to that same church. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved it is the power of God. He's not softening it. He's not apologizing. He's saying, yes, I know exactly how this sounds, and I'm telling you anyway. Which begs an obvious question. Why would anyone build a movement on the one thing guaranteed to make people walk away? And yet, a church took root there anyway. That's the real mystery here. Not that the message sounded foolish, but that it worked anyway, in one of the last places on earth you'd expect it to succeed. But here's what most people miss about the next verse. Paul pushes the idea even further. The foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. He's not claiming God is actually foolish. He's claiming God's most embarrassing-looking move still outperforms the most impressive thing human wisdom has ever produced. In a city built entirely on being impressive. That's not a soft claim. That's a direct hit on everything Corinth valued. Picture one of Corinth's famous debate halls, a trained speaker winning a crowd purely on delivery, the right pauses, the right gestures, an argument built to sound unbeatable. A few streets over, that same city is hearing about a crucified carpenter's son instead, and somehow walking away changed by that. Nothing about the second scene should have worked. That's exactly Paul's point. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn, though, because the question underneath all of this is bigger than Christianity. Why are humans naturally drawn to impressive things, even when they're wrong? Psychologists actually have a name for part of this: mistaking fluency for truth. Advertising, politics, everyday arguments, all of it runs on the same instinct Corinth had already perfected 2,000 years earlier. Corinth isn't the exception here. It's just an especially honest mirror. There's a short detail worth mentioning fast. Some scholars connect Paul's approach here to something that happened just before, in Athens, where he'd tried reasoning with philosophers on their own terms and mostly gotten mocked. Whether or not that's the reason, by the time he reaches Corinth, his own words are blunt. He decided not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Less debate, more cross. And that's when, by his own account, the message actually started spreading. Which brings us back to the mystery from earlier. Not just why the message worked, but who it worked on. That part might be the strangest detail of all. Paul tells the Corinthians to look around their own church afterward. Not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. Picture that room for a second. Not a lecture hall full of philosophers, dock workers, tradespeople, people from every level of society gathering in the same room, something Corinth's rigid social order rarely allowed. None of them were the crowd Corinth normally celebrated. Paul says that wasn't an accident. The whole point was making sure nobody could later stand up and claim they were clever enough to have figured it out themselves. So what does any of this mean 2,000 years later? Ask yourself what your version of Corinth actually is. Maybe it's not philosophy. Maybe it's your career, your image, being the person who always has the right answer in the room, the one whose opinion gets quoted back to them at dinner. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's the quiet pressure to have your life look put together online before you'd ever admit out loud that it isn't. The curated version versus the honest one. Whatever it is, Paul's argument cuts the same way. Anything you're leaning on instead of the cross is exactly the wisdom he's talking about. Not because those things are bad, but because none of them can actually do what he says the cross does. And here's the quietly comforting part, the one most people skip past. If this faith ran on human intelligence, you'd spend your whole life wondering if you were smart enough, well-read enough, prepared enough to really get it. Always one step behind someone more educated, always waiting for a better footnoted version of the story. Because Paul says God chose the foolish thing on purpose, none of that gatekeeping applies to you. You don't need a theology degree to stand at a cross and understand what happened there. A dock worker in Corinth could understand it just as deeply as the most trained philosopher in Athens ever could, arguably more deeply, with nothing clever standing in the way. According to Paul, that was never an accident. That was the entire plan, built in from the very first sentence. The cross never stopped looking weak. It still does, to plenty of people today. Somewhere, right now, someone is probably still carving their own version of that mocking graffiti. What changed, for the ones Paul was writing to, and maybe for you, was never the cross itself. It was the eyes looking at it. So here's the question worth sitting with. And I genuinely like your honest take in the comments, whatever you believe. Do you think Paul's message still sounds foolish today? Or has the modern world simply found new reasons to reject the same thing? Tomorrow, we stay in this letter and look at exactly who Paul says God chose to fill that Corinthian church. Dock workers, tradespeople, people Corinth had already written off. The answer says something uncomfortable about who gets chosen today, too, and it might not be who you'd expect. That's next.